Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from before we start. In the dark mountains of the American East, two young cousins got such a bad name that their names were taken off of official records. Today, we'll talk about what happened there. It all began in the forgotten valleys between West Virginia and Kentucky with Levi and Jonas. They were both 18 years old at the time. It was the June 7th, 1867. The Civil War ended only 2 years ago, but it left deep scars all over the United States. The Appalachians were very different from the rest of the country. They were separated from it by deep canyons and thick forests that never seemed to end. There were no roads, just dirt paths, and many communities were cut off from each other. When you were in this very remote area, the laws of the federal government didn't seem to apply. People were in charge of their own justice there, where people could hide their secrets among the fall leaves. Their due dates were the same in January 1849. They were born on a small farm in the mountains of Pike County, Kentucky. Their parents were brothers who married two sisters from a nearby family, making their blood ties even stronger. The two families lived in cabins that were only a few hundred yards apart. They worked together in the tobacco and cornfields to make ends meet. The two of them were brothers and grew up together, to the biological siblings they have. From a young age, they couldn't be separated. They would go on long hikes through the mountains together and come back with strange stories that no one could confirm. There aren't many county records from that time, but the ones that are there paint a disturbing picture. In 1863, when Levi and Jonas were only 14, the local church records talk about an incident between the two cousins and a traveling merchant who was camping close to the family home. The man went missing. Not a trace of them. His wagon was found 2 miles into the woods, empty and with all of its contents still in good shape. There was no sign of its owner. The local government, which was mostly made up of a sheriff who was in charge of 3 different counties, did a quick investigation and threw out the case as one of voluntary desertion. What people in the small villages did, though, was whisper in the wooden taverns that were used as meeting places. Stories began to spread. People said Levi and Jonas knew every part of those mountains, including every cave and deep gorge. The ground never got any sunlight. It was said that they had seen bonfires higher up in the hills on nights when there was no moon, heard strange sounds in the valleys, and found trails that led nowhere. Families started to keep their kids closer to home when it got dark. The Civil War made things even worse in the area. A lot of young men were asked to join the military, but Levi and Jonas were never found in any records from either side. During those 4 bloody years, they just went deeper into the mountains. When the war was over, as the survivors went back to their homes, the cousins showed up as if nothing had happened. But now something was different. They were 18 years old, grown up, and away from everyone else. To this day, no one knows what they learned in that time of complete isolation. Reports from the government began to come out in the summer of 1867. A family of settlers moving west had disappeared while they were passing through the area. Follow the old trail that went through the mountains of Pike County. There were 5 people in 2 wagons, the last spot. A trading post was only 5 miles from where Levi and Jonas lived. That's where they were seen. Abraham Tucker, who owned the post, told the police that the travelers had bought food for 3 weeks' worth of travel and set out at dusk on the main trail. They were not seen again. 6 weeks later, hunters found the wagons left behind in a clearing some 15 kilometers from the main trail. Even though everything had been smashed, strangely nothing valuable had been taken. There was cash under one of the wagon's floors, jewelry in a chest, and pricey tools hanging off the side. No one knew what had happened to those 5 people. There were no bodies or blood to find, and nothing to suggest where they went or what happened. The thin mountain air made it seem like they had just disappeared. There were questions from the county sheriff, whose name was William Hendricks. He knocked on doors and talked to everyone in the area to find out anything. When he got to Levi and Jonas's family home, he only found parents of the boy. They said that their cousins were going on a long hunting trip in the mountains and wouldn't be back for a few weeks. Everything was written down by Hricks in his old leather notebook, but he didn't have the power or tools to do much more. He went back to the county seat and turned in another case that hadn't been solved. But the stories kept going. Travelers who had to go through that area started reporting strange things happening to them. They said that people were following them along the trails and that shadows were moving through the trees. That looked like it was looked at night. Some people said they swear they heard voices whispering in languages they didn't know. Others said they saw strange symbols carved into the trees that no one knew what they meant. People began to avoid the path that went through those mountains whenever they could, even if it meant adding days to the trip. That same year, several families who lived close to Levi and Jonas's land sold it for far more than Levi and Jonas asked for it, less than the market value, and moved to other places. In the sales documents, some vaguely said that they left quickly because of unsafe conditions or an unpleasant environment. Within months, the number of people living in that mountain area dropped by a huge amount. The Appalachian valleys were always foggy in the fall of 1867. The fog never seemed to lift completely. The leaves on the trees turned shades of deep red and burnt orange, making the scenery look both beautiful and scary. It was. Things started to get even darker during this time of year. The Pike County Gazette, a local newspaper, wrote a series of short articles about the disturbing number of people going missing. At least 9 people went missing in the mountainous area around the Levi and Jonas family's property between July and October of that year. The pattern that started to show up in these cases was what made them so scary. The people who died were all traveling alone, or small groups that are going through the area. None of them were from the area. They were travelers, traders, prospectors looking for new land, families moving west, or war veterans coming home. They were not people that anyone would immediately look for, or that could disappear without setting off alarms. It seemed like someone was picking out people who wouldn't leave big holes in society. The authorities in the area became interested in one case in particular. That September, a doctor named Henry Blackwell was on his way from west. He went from Virginia to Kentucky with his case for medical instruments and a lot of laudanum and morphine that he had bought in Charleston. Many people in the area knew Blackwell, and he had written to his wife to say that he would be in Cumberland Gap in 10 days. He never showed up. His desperate wife was able to get the police in West Virginia to start a more thorough search. 12 people were put together to find Blackwell's last known path. They learned that the doctor had died. In a small town called Elkhorn City, he had helped a farmer who had a high fever. People in the area confirmed that he had left the next morning, following the trail that went straight through the area and is now being linked to the disappearances. It took 3 whole weeks to search. They found Blackwell's horse wandering around near a creek. The saddle and saddlebag were still on the horse. His clothes, some medical books, and a small amount of cash were in the saddlebags, but the valuable medicines were not. His music case was gone, and so was Blackwell himself. What really made people suspicious was what a hunter named Samuel Morrison said. He swore in front of the sheriff that he had seen 2 young men on a side trail carrying something heavy that was wrapped in canvas. They looked just like Levi and Jonas. As was common among mountain people, Morrison said he greeted them, but the 2 cousins just stared at him until he went on his way. Something was in their eyes, Morrison wrote later. Told him something that made him cold, even though it was September and very hot outside. He didn't look back. Instead, he sped up until he was no longer near the trail. Sheriff Hicks finally decided that there was enough proof to question Levi and Jonas in a formal way. He got 6 deputies together and rode to the family farm in early October. What they found there was hard to explain. There was no one in the main cabin. A few weeks ago, faraway neighbors said that the boys' parents had left. They said they were in Tennessee visiting family and didn't know when they would be back. Levis's and Jonas's cabins were both locked from the outside with heavy chains. From the inside, boards had been put up over the windows. Hicks told them to break down the doors. It was a surprise how clean and organized the cabin's insides were. Of course, there were no signs of a fight or violence, but the atmosphere was very unsettling. Strange marks were on the wooden walls, like someone had scratched them over and over with. Sharp things. There were stacks of old newspapers in the corner of one cabin. All of them had stories about crimes and disappearances circled in charcoal. In another, they found a leather-bound notebook with a lot of notes written in handwriting that was so small it was almost impossible to read. People never got the whole notebook's contents out, but bits and pieces got out through conversations in pubs and other public places. They talked in great detail about how they had watched travelers and when certain trails were busy. Busiest, giving physical descriptions of people who had been through the area. There were rough maps that showed caves and ravines that were not on any official maps. There were lists of tools and supplies as well as notes about how long it took for different things to break down in different conditions. That kind of content made everyone who read it sick to their stomach. Hicks took the notebook and all the newspapers away, locked the cabins again, and put guards on the property. In the end, he hoped Levi and Jonas would return, but the cousins didn't show up for days or weeks. They seemed to have sensed that the police were coming and then vanished into the Appalachian mountains. There were thousands of square miles of forests in that area, and the valleys were so far away that no white person had ever been there. It would be like looking for 2 specific needles in a barn the size of a state to find 2 people who knew that area very well. At the same time, the disappearances stopped all of a sudden. In October, November, and December, between January and December 1867, not a single traveler went missing in that area. It was like the cousins and the threat had both gone away. As the air got better, people went back to the trails they had been avoiding for months. Some people in the area thought Levi and Jonas had left for the uncharted West, maybe to Colorado or even California. Others thought they had died in the mountains, either in an accident or because of a wild animal. But there were people who knew those mountains better than anyone else. They were experienced hunters and trackers who had spent decades going to every valley and peak. They couldn't believe their cousins were gone. They said that Levi and Jonas were just being more careful and patient. They said the Appalachians had memories and were very protective of their secrets. Up there were places where time seemed to have stopped, and the idea of civilization seemed far away and pointless. That year, winter came with a vengeance. Many trails were blocked by heavy snowfall, cutting off whole communities for weeks at a time. There was snow on everything. A white blanket that made it impossible to tell the difference between trails and plain depressions in the ground. During that harsh winter, rumors started to spread once more. Hunters who went to the most remote areas said they saw smoke coming from places no one should have been. Others said they had seen new footprints in the snow. The footprints were always in pairs and were always moving away toward the mountain areas that were hardest to get to. Thor came in the spring of 1868 with news that would make anyone's blood run cold. As the snow on the lower slopes of the mountains started to melt, a group of lumberjacks working near the Levisa Fork River found something that made them drop their tools and ride right to the closest town. A collection of personal items spread out over an area of about 100 square meters was found in a narrow ravine. Some of them were hidden by fallen branches and thick vegetation. There are ripped clothes, wet documents, rusty tools, and even toys that look like they belong to families who are traveling. Police Chief Hendricks set up an immediate expedition to get to the site. What his team wrote down that day is now part of Pike County's most upsetting records. Over the last 2 years, at least 37 different things could be linked to people who went missing. A Bible with the name of a family that had been missing since August of the previous year. Someone who went missing in June left behind a pocket watch with their initials engraved on it. Letters meant for people in faraway towns were never sent or received. It looked like someone had made a macabre memory bank of short lives. But what was most disturbing was that there were no remains at all. There were no bodies or bones to show what happened to those people in the end. Step by step, the ravine was searched. Dogs that can sniff were brought in from 3 different states. In different places, they dug into the ground, looked into every crack in the rocks, and followed every path that led from that spot. Nothing. It looked like the things were placed there on purpose. A message with no words. A puzzle that couldn't be solved logically. Hrix knew. He had to find Levi and Jonas, and not just to question them. The state was now putting pressure on him to do so. The governor of Kentucky knew about the string of disappearances and asked for answers. There were rewards for information that helped catch the cousins. In every town and village within 200 meters, posters with full descriptions of both were put up. Each winner got $500, which was a lot of money back then and could have bought a whole farm with land and animals. But no one showed up, forward with information you can trust. As far away as Ohio in the north and North Carolina in the south, people said they had seen them, but none of them could be proven. Some bounty hunters tried to find the cousins in the mountains, but they all came back empty-handed because the area was so huge and dangerous. One of these bounty hunters, Dutch Keller, who was known for never losing a suspect, looked for 6 weeks in the mountains. For Jonas and Levi. He was clearly shaken when he got back. He wouldn't talk about what he had seen or done up there, took his half pay, and left the area, promising never to come back. There was a slow return to normalcy in the mountain towns during the spring and summer of that year. Folks learned to travel together to stay away from well-known paths and to only camp in open areas where they could see if anyone was coming. There had been no more disappearances, which led to careful relief. It's possible that the cousins had really left for faraway places. Maybe it was because of how harsh the mountains are. Or maybe they were just waiting, watching, and making plans. A strange event in July 1868 shed new light on the case. A man named Jacob Thornton showed up at the Pikeville Sheriff's Office, clearly weak and staggering. Thornton was one of the travelers who didn't show up in September of the previous year. Everyone thought he was dead, but he was still alive, though in a terrible way. Trouble. He was very skinny, his skin was burned from the sun, and his clothes were torn apart. When he tried to speak, his hands shook so badly that he couldn't hold it together, and it took him hours to be able to tell his story in a way that made sense. Thornton said that he was caught on the trail by 2 young men who looked exactly like Levi and Jonas. At first, they were friendly and offered him directions, but when he let down his guard, he was attacked and knocked out. He woke up in a deep cave, chained to a rock wall. He spent weeks in that dark place, getting just enough food to stay alive every so often. The cousins showed up from time to time, but they were always quiet and watching. They never talked to him or told him anything. Thornton's story became more and more disturbing. He talked about hearing other sounds in the cave, like moans and echoes of voices that were far away. These sounds seemed to come from deeper tunnels. Occasionally he believed he was crazy and that his mind was making things up in the pitch-black room. He said it looked like the cousins, be doing some kind of experiment to see how long people could stay alone, how they reacted to extreme fear, and how they behaved when they had no hope. The chains were taken off one day, but Thornton never understood why. He was left in the cave by himself with just a little water and food. He waited for hours and days, but no one came back. He finally got the courage to go into the tunnels and follow the air currents until he found a way out. It took him. He was completely lost in the mountains for weeks and lived on stream water and tree roots until he finally found a trail that led him back to civilization. After Thornton testified, the investigation became very different. No longer were the disappearances the only thing that was going on. Now there was direct proof of kidnapping and jail time. The governor gave the go-ahead for a special task force of 20 men to be put together. The men would include experienced trackers and war veterans with military training. It was the mission. Okay, find the cave that Thornton talked about, and if you can, find Levi and Jonas and capture them. Even though he was sick, Thornton agreed to lead the expedition, but this time a big problem came up. It was hard for him to remember where he had come from. He couldn't remember specific landmarks because he had been hungry and lost for weeks. He could remember types of rocks, a stream that ran in a certain direction, and a spot where old fires had killed many trees. But there were thousands of places in the Appalachians that were just like these. Lack of specifics. The expedition left in the middle of August with enough food for a month. They took weapons, ropes, lanterns, and simple maps of the area. They followed Thornton through the mountains while he tried to figure out how to get back. They explored a lot of caves. Some were so deep that their lanterns could only light up a few meters at a time. In some of them, they found evidence of people living there, like old fire pits, marks on the walls, and even animal bones that had clearly been processed to make food. The expedition went through the mountain's most remote areas for 4 weeks, going to places where official maps only showed blank spaces that meant they had not been explored yet. There was a forest so thick that the sun hardly reached the tops of the trees, making it always dark, even in the middle of the day. The air was thick with the smell of mold and wet moss. It looked like every valley was the same. It's possible to mistake each rock formation for dozens of others. It was a natural maze that didn't make any sense. Direction. Jacob Thornton tried his best to lead the group, but it was clear that the stress was making it hard for him to remember things. When they got to the top of a mountain, he would change his mind hours later because the view didn't match what he remembered. He would point to a mountain ridge and say he was sure it was there. As the expedition's men got angrier, some said they thought Thornton had made up the whole story or was just too confused to help. However, Sheriff Chris insisted on going on. That mountain range felt like it had something in it. Tricks, buried as deeply as the roots of very old trees. On a very hot September afternoon, the expedition came across something that supported at least some of Thornton's claims. One of the trackers saw something strange on a few trees while they were exploring a narrow valley. The carvings were done on purpose, and the symbols made a pattern that repeated. They found the entrance to a cave by following these symbols like a trail of breadcrumbs. The entrance was partly hidden by a carefully placed mess of branches and rocks. It wasn't the result of nature. The entrance had been hidden by someone. With their weapons drawn, the men carefully cut off the branches, ready for the worst. The entrance that was shown was low and narrow, so people had to crawl to get inside. Hurricks told them to turn on all the flashlights they could find and split into 2 groups. One half would stay outside and watch, while the other half would go inside and look around. When Thornton saw the doorway, he started to shake badly. That he was sure he knew this place or one very much like it before. After the first 10 meters of narrow tunnel, the cave's interior opened up into a bigger room. It was possible that the ceiling was 5 or 6 meters high, and there were clear signs of long-term use. Soot had built up on the walls and rocky ceiling of the stone circles where fires had been lit, and piles of cut firewood were stacked in a neat way. In one corner, they found simple tools like axes, knives, saws, and hammers. These tools had all been used a lot and had been well taken care of. But what really got their attention were the tunnels that go off of that main room. Each of the at least 5 different paths went deeper into the mountain. As they went through each one, the group decided to leave marks on the walls to help them find their way back. They went through the first tunnel and into a smaller room. This one had something in it that made even the toughest men feel cold. Heavy chains were clearly put on by people because they were attached to the rock walls in several places. The metal was rusty but still strong. When Thornton saw the chains, he went crazy. He was adamant that this, or a place very much like it, was where he had been held. The men looked through the whole room, trying to find any clues about how many people might have been held there. It looked like someone had tried to dig through the solid rock because they saw scratch marks on the walls. Some places had initials carved into them. The letters were crooked, like they were made with sharp stones or metal pieces. The men planned ahead by writing down each initial in their notebooks, to later compare them with records of people who have gone missing. Similar chambers were found in the other tunnels. Some were bigger than others, but they all showed signs of having been used for disturbing purposes. In one, they found piles of fabric that made it almost impossible to tell what the clothes were because of the time and humidity. In another, there was a group of personal items like watches, rings, military medals, and even a few gold and silver coins set up on natural shelves made by rock outcroppings. It looked like a museum of lives, and macabre was cut short. It took 2 full days to fully explore the cave. They made maps of at least 15 different chambers that were linked by a complicated system of tunnels. A man had to crawl on his stomach through some of the passages that were very narrow. Some were big enough for 3 men to walk next to each other. The cave went deep into the mountain, and there were vertical shafts that led to unknown depths in a few places. Men threw stones into the shafts and timed how long it took for them to hear the impact. Below. Some took longer than 5 seconds, which means they fell more than 100 meters. What they never found, which was both good and bad, were bodies. There were no bodies, skeletons, or any other physical signs that someone had died in those caves. There was a mystery inside a mystery. All of those chains, all of those marks of pain on the walls, all of those personal items, but no bodies. Where did the people who died go? What did Levi and Jonas have to do with them? Some of the men on the expedition thought that the deep wells might be the answer. It's possible that the cousins just threw the bodies in those dark cracks so no one would ever find them. Others thought that underground rivers might have been able to carry the evidence a long way. Some people even thought that the cousins might have burned their prisoners to death, which would explain why there was so much ash in the fire rings. But these were all just theories that couldn't be proven without real evidence. Harris told everyone to carefully list all the things they found and take them out of the cave. The group worked, methodically, wrapping each thing and writing down where it had been found. It took them 3 days to get everything back to civilization. The sheriff was going to use these things to try to find more victims by linking names to people who have gone missing in the past few years. At the same time, guards were stationed at the entrance to the cave. Even though it was clear that Levi and Jonas's base of operations was empty for days on end, people kept hoping that they would return. Cousins. For some reason, they seemed to have a sixth sense for danger and could smell police officers from miles away. Or maybe they had more than one base spread out in those endless mountains. This was just one of many. When the cave was found, word quickly spread through the area. There were stories about the case in newspapers in Kentucky, West Virginia, and even farther away states. The whole October 1868 issue of the Pike County Gazette was about what they called the scary Appalachian Cave. Reporters came from all over the world to see the site, but most of them were turned away by the authorities. who were still keeping a close eye on the area. As winter 1868 came earlier than planned, it brought snowstorms that made it impossible to keep an eye on things in the cave. The guards had to leave their posts when the blizzards made it impossible for anyone to get to them. Rix had no choice but to stop the operation for now and planned to start it up again the next spring. Heavy boards were nailed across the entrance to the cave to keep it closed, but everyone knew this was more of a show than a real barrier. Anyone with the drive could take those boards down in minutes. Something interesting started to happen in the mountain towns during those cold, lonely months. For the first time in years, people who had been quiet started telling stories they had kept to themselves. It seemed like the cave discovery brought up a lot of memories and fears that had been pushed down. In bars warmed by, people in the area started to speak out in churches with roaring fireplaces where people were getting together to get through the winter. An old rancher named Ephraim Walsh told them that he had seen Levi and Jonas on a remote trail about 5 years before. They were carrying big canvas bags on their shoulders. They told him what they were carrying, venison, and then they went on their way without saying anything else. Walsh said that the smell coming from those bags wasn't. Yes, he had spent decades hunting in those mountains and knew that the meat didn't smell like the deer he was used to seeing. But he wasn't going to ask any more questions because the cousins were getting a bad reputation. A woman named Martha Cunningham said that her 22-year-old daughter had a bad experience with her cousins 3 years before. The young woman was picking berries near the family home when Levi and Jonas appeared out of nowhere, as if they were made of nothing. The trees. They stood around her and stared at her so hard that it scared her. They didn't say a word. She threw down her basket and ran until she got home. Martha had never told this story in public because she was afraid of getting in trouble. But since her cousins didn't seem to be around anymore, she felt safer telling them. There were a lot of stories like that. People who had been following their cousins for miles said that they mysteriously disappeared as they got close to people. People who woke up at 3 a.m., they felt like someone was watching them through the windows of their cabin. Traders said their goods went missing overnight from their wagons. Always certain things like tools, lanterns, ropes, and chains. Small events that didn't seem important on their own painted a picture of two people who had been working in secret for years, long before the disappearances were officially reported. The work of making a list of the things that were found in the cave went on all winter. Rix worked with police from several states to match the items to records of missing people. The process was slow and often frustrating. A lot of the victims were migrants or travelers who didn't leave any records. Most of the time, there were no photos or detailed descriptions in the police reports, but they were still able to make some strong connections. James Theodore Mason was a bookseller who went missing in April 1867 while on a trip. His silver pocket watch had the initials JTM engraved on it. Getting from Prestonburg to Pikeville. A woman named Elizabeth Garrett and her husband had gone missing in June of that same year. Her wedding ring had names and a date written on it. The sister of one of the victims said that a cameo brooch belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a teacher who had agreed to work at a rural school but never got there. Each identification made the families feel a mix of relief and new grief. They were glad to know that their loved ones hadn't just left them. Old lives. It was proof that something terrible had happened, but it also meant accepting that they probably would never have bodies to bury or full answers about how those people died. As spring came around in 1869, new problems came up. As soon as the trails could be used again, the first groups went back to the cave and found that the board that blocked the entrance had been torn out and thrown away. In the winter, someone had been there. The inside of the cave looked like it had been used recently. There were ashes in one of the fire rings, footprints in the dust on the floor, and even food scraps that weren't there in the fall. But there was something else that made the investigation team very nervous. Someone had carved a message into one of the walls of the main room. The letters were big and deep, and it was clear that a lot of time and work went into carving them. The message was short and to the point. You will never understand. There was no signature, but everyone knew who sent it, had written that message. It was a direct challenge, an admission of being better, and a claim that Levi and Jonah were too hard for normal people to understand. Chris made the search effort stronger. More men were asked to join. There were more resources given out. As the public and the press put more pressure on the governor, he agreed to use state funds for the operation. People from as far away as Virginia and Tennessee were hired to work as trackers. The search for the Appalachian cousins grew into one of the biggest searches ever. Operations that had ever been done in that area up to that point. Several expeditions searched the mountains all through the spring and summer. They went into hundreds of caves, hiked along countless trails, and talked to every person they could find who lived in the area. They found 3 more caves that had been used in the same way as the first one. Each one was full of chains, tools, and personal items from victims. There was no doubt that Levi and Jonas had set up a network of hiding spots spread out over a large area. The cousins, on the other hand, stayed ghosts. There were occasional reports of sightings, but they always came from people who were very far away and were by themselves, so there were no witnesses to back up their stories. A hunter said he saw 2 men watching him from a cliff far away. A shepherd, walking his sheep through the mountains, said he came across a hastily abandoned campfire that was still going. But when the police went to these places, they never found anything solid. What really made the search hard was the unbelievably large size of the area. At that time, the Appalachians were mostly wild and had not been explored. In some valleys, no one had been there in generations, or maybe ever. There are forests that are so thick that a person could be 10 meters away and not be seen at all. There were cave systems that went for miles below the ground, and many of them are still not mapped out after decades. People who didn't want to be found could hide there without being seen. As the summer went on, as time went on and nothing changed, frustration grew. Some people began to wonder if Levi and Jonas were still in the area. They might have used the winter to get away to faraway places. They might have been in Colorado, Oregon, or any of the other places where a man could go and start a new life without being caught. The western edge of the United States was still growing, and there were many places where records were missing and people's past identities didn't matter. In the fall of 1869, brought about a surprise turn of events. Sheriff Hendrick's office got a message on the phone from Harland, a small town farther south in the Kentucky mountains. During his shift as sheriff, Cyrus Dalton said that 2 people who looked like Levi and Jonas had been seen buying supplies at a general store. Because the 2 young men were acting nervously and buying an unusually large amount of chains and ropes, the storekeeper called the police. Hicks left right away with a team of 8 people. It took 3 days of riding on rough trails to get to Harland. When they got there, Dalton told them that the suspects had left 2 days before, with their purchases on a packer. But the merchant had been able to figure out where they were going, and pointed them in the direction of a very remote area called Black Mountain. This area had high peaks and deep valleys, and was known for being dangerous for even the most experienced trackers. The chase began early the next morning. They followed what they thought was the cousins' trail. The team had grown to 12 men and included local trackers who knew the area well. In the first few days, they found evidence that made them feel good. Leaves from recent campsites, footprints that matched 2 men and a loaded horse, and even some trash, like food packaging and a broken tool that the trader said he sold to the suspects. But as they went further into the Black Mountains, it got harder to find the trail. Levi and Jonas seemed to know they were being chased and were attempting to block their path on purpose. They got married by streams so as not to leave marks, on rocky ground so as not to leave marks, and by making false trails that led to nowhere. The trackers, who had been doing their jobs for decades, said they had never seen fugitives who were so good at hiding their tracks. They were chasing for 10 days straight before they finally got lucky. They found a cave that clearly had been lived in not long ago. It was still warm by the fire. On makeshift bark plates, food that had only been half-eaten lay, and the blankets were strewn around like someone had to leave quickly. Levi and Jonas were not there, but the pack horse was tied down near the entrance. It was still full of things they bought in Harland. Hrix told half of the men to stay hidden and watch over the cave, while the other half searched around it in circles that got bigger and bigger. It's possible that the cousins had just gone hunting or getting water and were planning to come back. The hours went by slowly. The sun came up, to set, making long shadows in the trees. As night fell, the team kept a silent watch, their nerves tense and their weapons ready. But no one came back to the cave. It was clear that something had told Levi and Jonas about the hunter when dawn came and the cousins were nowhere to be found. They might have used binoculars or telescopes to see the team from afar. They might have heard sounds that didn't belong in the forest. Or perhaps they had just grown a keen instinct for danger after being on the run for years. No matter what the reason was, they got away again. This time, they left behind useful things behind. As the abandoned camp was being looked into, interesting and upsetting details about how the cousins had been living were found. They found notebooks with notes, drawings, and observations in them that looked like the ones that were taken from the first cabin. There were hand-drawn maps of cave systems, some of which had symbols that no one could figure out. There were lists of things that had to be done. Supplies, detailed plans for different situations that could go wrong, and calculations of how long some foods would last. Worse was a diary that looked like it was written by one of the cousins, but there was no signature. There weren't many entries, and the ones that were there were written in a way that was confusing and sometimes made sense. They talked about the tests and observations, but they never said what they meant in detail. There were references to finding the limits and getting to the bottom of things, of ideas that weren't explained well enough. That kind of writing made me think of troubled minds trying to make sense of actions that don't make sense. For some reason, one entry caught Hrix's attention. It was from August of that year and said, "The mountains understand us even when people can't. Here we are free to explore questions that society doesn't want us to think about. Each subject teaches us something new about the limits of human experience. We are not monsters. We are students of the most basic condition of existence." It was a way of trying to intellectually justify actions that could not be intellectually justified. It turned horror into twisted philosophy. Hrix took all the documents that were found in the camp and ordered the search to continue. But after 2 more weeks of searching the Black Mountains without finding the cousins, the expedition had to turn back. Supplies were running low, the weather was getting colder, which meant winter was coming, and the men were totally worn out. They had been so close to winning the hunt, but just missed out at the last second. The winter of 1869-1870 was especially bad. Terrible blizzards cut off communities for weeks, and the temperatures dropped so low that animals died and families had to burn their furniture to stay warm. Search operations stopped until spring, and Hrix spent this time carefully going over all the documents that had been gathered, looking for patterns and clues about what had happened. During this period of intense study, Hrix started to notice something troubling. The writing made it seem like Levi and Jonas weren't acting on impulse. There was careful planning and a method to what they were doing. It was almost scientific in nature. They carefully chose their victims, people who wouldn't be immediately sought after, who were alone or in small groups, and who didn't have strong connections in the area. Studies of travel routes, isolated areas, and planned their hiding places ahead of time made it seem like there was a purpose beyond just violence. The cousins' references to experiments and observations made it sound like they thought they were discovering something or learning something through their horrible actions. It was a form of madness that looked like logic, turning cruelty into twisted intellectual curiosity. Critics started to feel sick. People thought the case was even more complicated and evil than anyone had first thought. When the search started up again in the spring of 1870, there was a renewed sense of urgency, but also a growing sense of desperation. It had been more than 2 years since the first cave was found, and Levi and Jonas always seemed to be one step ahead. Theories started to spread that the cousins had finally left the area, maybe running away to Canada to the north or Mexico to the south, where American authorities could not reach them. A thaw and a series of reports that made mountain communities afraid again started happening in April 1870. In just 6 weeks, 3 travelers went missing in a region between Pike and Letcher counties. The travelers went missing in the same way every time. They were traveling alone or with small groups, going through remote areas, and then disappearing without a trace. It was like Levi and Jonas were letting everyone know they were back. Or maybe they had never really left. The 43-year-old Reverend Thomas Whitfield was an itinerant preacher who went from community to community giving sermons in exchange for food and shelter. On the morning of April 15th, he left from a small congregation near Jenkins, saying he would get to another church in Elorn City by nightfall. The trip was about 15 miles across mountain trails, but Whitfield never made it. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering around loose with the saddle still on it, but there was no sign of him. Afterwards, 2 mountain coal seekers went missing. Their names were Daniel and Robert Crawford, and they were both in their 30s. Both were veterans of the Civil War and had decided to try their luck by looking for commercially viable mineral deposits. They told the innkeeper where they were staying that they would be exploring a certain area in the mountains and would be back in 3 days. When they didn't show up after a week, a search was organized, and their camp was found. All of the mining equipment and supplies were still there, but the Crawford brothers were nowhere to be found. The third disappearance was especially scary because it involved a woman, which hadn't happened in any other cases that had been reported before. Margaret Sullivan, 35, was traveling from Pikeville with her 19-year-old adult son, Patrick, to visit relatives in Prestonburg. They stopped to rest in a familiar clearing at noon on a clear May day. Patrick tied the horses and watered a nearby stream. When he came back in less than 10 minutes, his mother was gone. Her things were still there, her luggage was still there, and the shawl she had draped over a rock was still there, but Margaret was gone, as if she had been pulled out of the ground by unknown hands. Patrick Sullivan was desperate. He searched the area for hours, screaming his mother's name until he was hoarse. He went on every nearby trail, looked at every rock formation, and peered into every crack and hole. Finally, he was about to pass out, so he rode to the nearest town to call for help. Right away, a large search party was put together, including Sheriff Ricks, who was in the area looking into the disappearance of the Crawford brothers. At its peak, more than 50 men were searching for Margaret Sullivan over an area of more than 100 square kilometers. They used sniffer dogs to follow her scent for almost a mile toward the highest mountains, but lost it completely in a stream. There was no way for the dogs to continue searching for Margaret Sullivan because she was carried through the water. They never found any clothing or signs of a struggle, nothing. These 3 disappearances in a short amount of time caused a lot of panic in the area. Families who lived in remote areas started moving to larger towns, and those who had to stay on their remote properties started locking their doors and windows as much as possible. Even during the day, they kept loaded guns close by and only traveled in large, well-armed groups. The trails and roads that went through the mountain's most remote areas were almost empty. Traders stopped taking their usual routes, which meant that people in isolated areas had to travel much farther to get basic supplies. The regional press loved the cases. The Louisville Courier-Journal sent a special reporter to cover what they called the Appalachian Terror, and sensationalist articles came out. Every week, new stories came out about Levi and Jonas, cousins. Some were based on facts, but many were based on speculation and rumors. The stories about them became mythical. Some articles described them as superhuman monsters who could disappear into thin air and appear in multiple places at the same time. Others said they were in charge of a larger network of accomplices, and that Levi and Jonas were part of a criminal organization operating in the mountains. Ricks knew that the truth probably lay somewhere between the facts and the rumors. The cold, hard facts were scary enough, though. There were two men who knew these mountains better than anyone else and had spent years planning a complex network of hiding places and escape routes. They seemed to act in a planned and patient way. They weren't the supernatural monsters of the tabloids, but maybe even scarier. They were humans who had chosen a path of horror on purpose and justified their actions with some twisted philosophy that only they could understand. Under a lot of pressure from the governor and the public, a huge operation was launched in June 1870. More than 100 men were called up, including state militia, sheriffs from several counties, professional trackers, and even some Civil War veterans who knew how to use guerrilla tactics. The target area was about 300 square miles centered on Pike and Letcher counties, which is where most of the disappearances had happened. The plan was to divide the area into sections and do a systematic search of each section. They searched every cave, checked every abandoned cabin, and questioned every lone resident. It was the first time anything like this had ever been done in the area, and it was the biggest coordinated police effort the Appalachian Mountains had ever seen. It would take months to finish and use up a lot of resources, but authorities felt they had to do it because the terror had to stop. The first few weeks of the operation had mixed results. They found 2 more caves that Levi and Jonas had used, one with chains, and they found disturbing clothing that clearly belonged to victims, and other personal items that could be linked to missing people. But the cousins themselves remained ghosts, always one step ahead and out of reach. One event in particular showed how sneaky and brave the cousins had become. An 8-person search party was camped in a remote valley when they woke up in the middle of the night to find that their weapons had been stolen while they slept. All 8 rifles had been silently taken from them. When the men woke up in the morning, they found their weapons stacked about 50 meters from camp, all empty and with bullets scattered around them. It was a clear message. Levi and Jonas could get as close as they wanted, whenever they wanted, and the hunters could not stop them. The summer went by without any results, and the search team's frustration grew along with the heat in the mountain valleys. That started with so much hope was failing just like the others. The Appalachian Mountains were too big, too complicated, and full of natural hiding places for even 100 men to cover. Levi and Jonas had turned this land into their own kingdom, and they were the only ones who really knew how the game worked. In August, something unexpected happened that would completely change the course of the investigation. A man named Isaiah Brennan, who had been living alone, came to town. Brennan, who was in his 60s and lived alone in a cabin in the mountains of Letcher County, voluntarily went to Whitesburg to find the police. He had shut himself off from society decades before because he had lost all of his family to typhoid fever. He survived by hunting and farming, only meeting other people maybe 2 or 3 times a year to trade furs for food and other necessities. Brennan told a strange story. He said he had watched Levi and Jonas for months without them knowing. His cabin was in a remote valley that he said the cousins used to get from one part of their operations to another, Brennan was a great tracker because he had learned how to hunt and observe animals from native tribes when he was young. He knew how to move through the forests without leaving tracks or making noises. He had first noticed the cousins the previous winter and cautiously began to watch them. What Brennan said confirmed many of Hriks's suspicions. The cousins weren't just desperate runaways. They had several camps spread out over a large area and rotated between them on a regular basis. They had made trails through the mountains that avoided populated areas but still let them move quickly when needed. They carefully covered their tracks, spending hours making sure that no sign of their passage could be seen. More importantly, Brennan had found what he thought was the cousins' main base camp, which was in a place so remote that he couldn't even see it. It was a cave in a steep cliff that could only be reached by a very dangerous trail that required climbing at several points. The entrance to the cave was hidden by thick vegetation and could only be seen from a very specific angle. Brennan had seen the cousins entering and leaving the cave several times, often carrying supplies inside or taking things out to take to other places. Hriks was excited by this information, but he was also wary. Brennan might be telling the truth, or he might not. They were just one of many people who had come forward with stories that led nowhere. But Brennan's calm, detailed account of what he had seen made it seem real. He wasn't looking for reward or attention. He just felt it was his moral duty to share what he had learned after hearing about the latest disappearances. An expedition was immediately planned, but this time it would be small and quiet. Just Hriks, two of his most trusted deputies, and themselves. Brennan. The plan was to check out the cave's location without telling the cousins, and then come back with a bigger group if the information turned out to be correct. They left early in the morning of a late August day and followed Brennan along unmarked trails through rough terrain so bad that they had to leave their horses and keep walking. It was a 2-day journey of hard walking. Brennan led them through deep ravines where the sun barely reached, and over rocky ridges where one wrong step would mean disaster. They had to cut their way through dense forests with machetes, and through land that none of the men had ever seen before, not even Hriks with all his experience. It was easy to see why Levi and Jonas had chosen this area. No one could get there without a clear path. At the end of the second day, Brennan took them to a lookout point on a ridge across from the cliff where he said the cave was. Hriks could see that the cave was partly hidden. It was about 300 meters away, but even with magnification it was hard to make out because the natural camouflage was so good. They sat down to watch and stayed still, waiting for any sign of activity. Hours went by with no movement. As the sun went down, long shadows stretched across the valley, and Hriks was starting to think that maybe the cave was empty when he saw movement. 2 figures came out of the entrance so quickly that he could have missed them. If he had been there at the wrong time, he would have missed them. Even from a distance, and in the dimming light, the 2 men's movements looked familiar, like they had been close for years. The cousins, if they were indeed cousins, stayed at the entrance for a few minutes, looking around. Then they went back into the cave. An hour later, smoke started rising from a crack in the rocks above the entrance, which suggested they had started a fire inside. The plan was to spend the night there, so Hriks and his small group kept watch all night, taking turns watching, but there was no more movement until dawn. When the sun came up, Hriks had to make a tough choice. They could try to get closer to the cave and be sure that Levi and Jonas were living there, but they would risk being caught and losing their advantage. Or they could stay away, go back to civilization, and get together a larger attack. He chose the latter, knowing it would be the more important thing to do. Even though it meant waiting days longer, the return trip took a day and a half because they knew the route. As soon as they got to Whitesburg, Hriks started planning what he hoped would be the final operation. He chose 20 men who were all armed and ready for a dangerous mission. He also hired 3 professional climbers who had worked in mining operations in mountainous areas in case they needed to get to the. But there was a problem. The more people who were involved, the more likely it was that information would get out. Locals used to say that the mountains had ears, and news spread in mysterious ways through small towns. There was always the chance that someone would accidentally or on purpose tell the cousins. Chris put in place strict security measures. No one could know where the expedition was going until they were already on it, and families were not to be told. It was a completely secret plan. The expedition left in the first week of September 1870, carrying food for 2 weeks, climbing ropes, enough weapons for a small army, and a strong desire to finally end the hunt that had consumed their lives for years. Isaiah Brennan agreed to lead them again, even though he was clearly uncomfortable with the size of the group and the possibility of violence in the operation. They arrived in the area early the next morning. Before dawn on the 4th day of travel, they moved in complete darkness. Hicks had carefully planned every step of the operation. 10 men would take positions around the cliff where the cave was located, making a perimeter that would make any escape impossible. 5 more men would climb quietly to a point above the cave entrance, ready to descend quickly if needed. The last 5, including Hicks himself, would make the direct approach to the entrance as soon as the sun came up, making sure that everyone was inside. Planned well, but mountains rarely went as planned. As the men set up their positions in the dark, the terrain was even more dangerous than Brennan had said. The rocks were wet with morning dew, making climbing dangerous, and thick vegetation concealed holes and ledges that could twist ankles or worse. It took them almost 2 hours to get to their designated spots, and by the time they did, the sky was already starting to get lighter in the east. Hicks waited. He and his 4 friends waited until there was enough light to see clearly before giving the signal to move forward. They moved slowly toward the cave entrance, moving from cover to cover with their weapons drawn and all of their senses heightened. The distance that looked so small on the map turned out to be a maze of sharp rocks and tangled plants, so every step had to be planned and every movement had to be quiet. It took them almost 40 minutes to cover the last 100 meters. When they finally reached the entrance, it was quiet. He told his men to stay in defensive positions as he walked toward the dark opening. His heart was racing because he knew something wasn't right. He could feel the danger, like electricity in the air before a storm. He turned on a flashlight and pointed it into the cave. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cave was empty, completely empty. There were no chains, tools, supplies, or anything else. It was just bare. The walls were covered in soot from years of use, but everything that could be moved had been taken away. On the floor, 23 stones of similar sizes were carefully arranged in a straight line facing the exit. Levi and Jonas knew, even though it seemed impossible, how many men were coming and when they would arrive. They knew everything and had planned that last message, that last silent challenge. Each stone was a man and a reminder that the cousins were always watching, always one step ahead. A search of the cave and the area around it turned up nothing else. The cousins had cleaned up the whole place, leaving no sign of where they had gone or when. It could have been days ago or hours ago. There was no way to know. The climbing team looked in cracks above the cave for other ways out. They found several passages that led deeper into the mountain, but they all ended in dead ends or holes too small for a person to fit through. The expedition's morale was crushed. They had come so close and worked so hard, only to find another empty hideout. Some of the men started to say that they thought Levi and Jonas were somehow superhuman and had abilities beyond the normal. Chris knew this was just their frustration showing, but he had to admit that the cousins did show an almost supernatural ability. They had a supernatural ability to avoid being caught. It was like they had eyes and ears in impossible places. Isaiah Brennan was especially upset. He said he had seen the cousins entering that cave many times, but there was no way they could have known he was watching. But Levi and Jonas had clearly been alerted. Maybe they'd seen subtle signs that someone had passed along the nearby trails. Or maybe they'd just been moving around a lot. Lucky. No matter what happened, the result was the same. They got away again. The expedition spent another 5 days exploring the area, looking in every cave and rock formation within a few kilometers. They found signs of other ancient campsites that had been cleared out and left empty. They found trails that looked promising but led to rocky areas where footprints couldn't be seen. In a deep ravine, they found a collection of things that clearly belonged to someone. As if the cousins were getting rid of extra weight before a long trip, the bodies of the victims were dumped there. When the expedition finally got back to civilization in late September, Rix had to face the bitter reality of yet another failure. The news media had a field day with headlines questioning the authorities' competence. The governor expressed public disappointment. Mountain communities that were already living in constant fear felt there was no hope of safety. If an operation of this size couldn't catch 2 men, what could? But something. In the months that followed, strange things started to happen. The travelers stopped going missing completely in October, November, and December. Winter also passed without any problems. In the spring of 1871, a Thor came along with the cautious hope that maybe the cousins had really left the area this time. Maybe the constant pressure had finally forced them to look for other lands, or maybe something else had happened. In April of that year, a group of hunters made a grizzly bear. Found in a remote ravine in Perry County, which is south of the territory where most of the searches had been focused. They found the remains of a camp that had been destroyed by something violent. There were signs of a fight, broken equipment, and dark stains on the ground that could have been blood, but had been washed away by winter rains. They also found 2 skeletons partially buried under leaves and other debris. The bodies were clearly human, but were too badly damaged by animals and decomposition to be positively identified. The bodies of 2 adult men, about the same height and build, were buried close to each other, almost side by side. There were no clothes or other personal items to help figure out who they were. But something about the scene, the remote location, and the state of the destroyed camp made Rix suspicious. Could these be the bodies of Levi and Jonah? Had they finally met a violent end in the same mountains that had served as their hideout? It was hard to be sure because forensic science at the time wasn't very advanced, and there were no good ways to identify such badly decayed remains. Rix had the skeletons taken away and buried in unmarked graves. He wrote down where the discovery was made, but didn't tell anyone. He didn't want to give people false hope if the skeletons weren't his cousins, but he also didn't want to ignore the possibility that the case had finally come to an end. There was a strange quiet in the Appalachian Mountains. No more disappearances followed the pattern set by Levi and Jonas. The trails slowly started to be used more often again, and families who had fled to bigger towns started slowly returning to their remote homesteads. Life in the mountains went back to its normal rhythm, governed by the seasons and the difficulties of living in the country, rather than the fear of human predators hiding in the shadows. Sheriff William Hendris kept looking into the case on an as-needed basis. Rix worked as a detective until he retired in 1878. He kept meticulous records of everything he found, every witness he talked to, and every object he found. These records were later sent to the Pike County Records Office, where they stayed in dusty boxes in the basements of government buildings for decades. Rix died in 1887, taking with him any personal conclusions he had reached about the cousins' final fate. The identities of the 2 skeletons found in that ravine in 1871 have never been proven. There are different ideas about what happened. Some think it was Levi and Jonas, and that they were killed in a fight with other mountain dwellers, possibly hunters or other fugitives vying for the same territory. Others think the cousins had finally turned against each other, that years of being alone and doing more and more violent things had broken down the bond that held them together and led to their deaths. There were also people who didn't believe the skeletons belonged to the cousins. They said that there wasn't enough proof because no personal items had been found that could definitively link them to Levi or Jonas. Instead, they thought that the cousins had just left for faraway lands, maybe to the Wild West, where men with bad reputations could easily disappear into frontier towns and start new lives without being caught. At that time, the American landscape was still growing, so there were places where records didn't exist and identities could be made up. One particularly scary theory was going around. Elderly people who lived in the mountains thought that Levi and Jonas had not really left or died, but had just become more careful and patient. They pointed to the fact that travelers going missing would sometimes show up in remote areas decades later. These cases didn't happen as often, or in the same way as the ones from 1867 to 1870, but some people thought they were still the work of the same criminals, who were just more careful after almost being caught. At least 23 people went missing in the mountains of eastern Kentucky between 1867 and 1870, following the usual pattern. This number comes from official records, but many historians think the real number may be much higher. These were travelers no one expected, migrants without strong family ties, and people who were already living on the edges of society. How many of these people went missing without ever being reported to the police? How many families just thought their loved ones had died? Caves that were found during the investigations were eventually sealed by local authorities. However, because of the way the mountains are formed, there will always be many more unknown caves where secrets can stay buried for hundreds of years. To this day, hunters and explorers still find strange things deep in the Appalachian Mountains, like a rusty chain attached to a rock wall, or initials carved in places that don't make sense. They have also found collections of animal bones that have been arranged in strange ways. Each new discovery makes us wonder how many more secrets those old mountains still hold. The story of Levi and Jonah turned into a local legend that was told around campfires at night to scare young people who were planning to explore the most remote parts of the mountains. Like many legends, it got better with each telling. Some said they were giants with superhuman strength, while others said they were practitioners of the dark arts who did evil rituals deep in caves. The truth, as is often the case, is somewhere in the middle. There were two men who, for reasons we will never fully understand, chose a path of violence and terror. The cousins' written records, especially the diary found at Black Mountain Camp, gave us disturbing clues about why they did what they did. They talked about pushing limits and exploring parts of the human experience that society purposely ignores. Their writings had a strange, philosophical quality to them, as if they were trying to figure out. Those who can cause pain without feeling guilty hide behind complicated explanations. The families of the confirmed victims never got the closure they needed. They had no bodies to bury and no definitive answers about their loved ones' last moments. Instead, they were left with painful absences and endless questions. Some set up symbolic memorials, like empty headstones in family cemeteries to mark the graves of the victims. Some people tried to move on with their lives, carrying their grief with them in silence for the rest of their days. The case was eventually marked as unsolved, and it still is. The Pike County Archives still hold boxes of evidence and documents related to the disappearances of those years. Researchers and historical mystery fans sometimes ask to see these archives to look for clues that previous generations may have missed, but the mountains protect their secrets. Even after more than 150 years, the full truth about Levi and Jonas is still as hard to find as the cousins were during those terrible years. Their legacy, if you can call it that, is a dark reminder that evil doesn't always have to be supernatural or unusual. Sometimes it's just too human. Two people who grew up together and had blood ties and childhood memories in common, but somehow developed such a distorted view of humanity that they could treat other lives as objects. They tell scary stories about monsters that aren't from myths or fairy tales, but real people with scary faces. The Appalachian Mountains are still as majestic and uninterested as they were when they were first formed. The deep valleys still cast shadows even in the middle of the day, and the caves still reach into the incomprehensible darkness. And somewhere in that ancient vastness, maybe buried under layers of leaves from over 100 years ago, or lost in deep cracks that will never see light, once more lie the bodies of two young people whose lives were cut short by actions that history tried to forget, but never quite managed. This is the story of Levi and Jonas, cousins from the Appalachians who turned out to be too evil for even the history books. It's a story with no clear ending, no clear justice, no satisfying closure. Instead, it's full of questions that keep coming up over the years and mountains that may hold secrets that have never been fully revealed. Let us know what you think by leaving a comment below. If you want to see more disturbing stories that history tried to hide but should be remembered, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. If you know someone who likes true historical mysteries, please share this video. Sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that make us question what we think we know about people until the next investigation into the shadows of thee.